Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nikki Lindsay. Thanks as always to the Talks team for enabling today's webinar. Our host today is Philippa Allison. Last September, my husband and I had a great day exploring the Stowe Landscape Garden in Buckinghamshire, following which we discovered that although the house was currently closed for visitors, it was possible to explore parts of the fascinating conservation and restoration work at very close quarters from a scaffold. Even if you haven't done that, you might recognise some of the interiors of the house from the Netflix series The Crown. Leading the scaffold tour that day last September was today's speaker, Nick Morris, the Chief Executive Officer of the Stowe House Preservation Trust. The story of this eminent house, the rise and fall of its various owners, and the programme to restore this Grade 1 listed mansion with all the specialists involved will all be covered. However, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A tab to ask questions as we go along so that I can collate them to put to Nick at the end. After the talk, we will finish with a few words from our chair, Roy Henderson. So now let me pass over to Nick for his talk entitled Making Every Penny Count, Restoring a House Where No Expense Was Spared.
Thank you, Nikki, and good afternoon to everybody. I might say at the outset that the scaffolding tour that Nikki underwent in September will be available again, this time in the dining room from May, just in case I forget the commercial at the end. So you've seen the title. This is very much a house where no expense was spared in the building, although occasionally we do come across little quirks that we think, my goodness, they've saved some money in the cut a corner there. My job is to make sure that every penny we spend on the restoration counts so that we actually do as much work as we possibly can. My next slide just gives a little bit of personal background. I'm not a long-term professional in the heritage world, but it's been a long-term interest. I started my working life in the Royal Air Force. I served 28 years and finished as the head of logistics for the Air Force and responsible for all the large aircraft and training aircraft fleets. Decided in about 2005, it was probably time to get a real job. So I left, I actually took an MA in heritage management, joined Transport for London. The scene on the right is the security work in Whitehall, managing London's road network. And I came to Stowe in August 2009, initially to work for the school. And for the last 2.5 years, I've worked just for the House Preservation Trust in semi-retirement. So for those of you who've not been to Stowe, I thought it might be useful just to show you a very short 3-minute promotional video. This is a whistle-stop tour of in through the landscape gardens and around the house. It's set to music composed by one of Stowe School's music teachers. So here we go with the video. there are times when I feel that we should actually just let the house speak for itself and keep quiet. But that's an appetizer, if you like, a little encouragement to come and see the house. And it was funded thanks to the Cultural Recovery Fund, because like so many heritage attractions now, we found that the best way to reach people is actually taking the house to you while you can't come to the house. But we look forward to welcoming visitors again soon. So a little bit of story about the house, and many of you will know a bit about it, probably most famous for being the home of Stowe School, but it started out as the ancestral home of the Temple Grenvilles, who the Temple family came to Buckinghamshire in the 17th century. The first house was built in the 1680s, and they were sheep farmers. They rose to a dukedom in 200 years, largely through political wheeler dealing. They were very ambitious. The wider family produced 4 prime ministers and numerous government ministers, and they were part of that great Whig aristocracy that extended up to the Spencers at Althorpe in Northamptonshire and all around here. Sadly, like many houses, the owners didn't always have the means to entertain and to live the way they did. In the late 18th century, early 19th century, the Marquis of Buckingham, George Grenville, had a thing called the Tellership of the Exchequer, and he got a percentage of every single government contract, which of course for the Napoleonic Wars was very lucrative. He relinquished that, but his son and his grandson carried on spending, although his grandson tried to do something to arrest the decline. But they were declared bankrupt in the mid-19th century, and they went from being one of the richest families in the land to the greatest debtors. The first great sale was held in 1848, not long after a royal visit in 1845, and it was rumoured that when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited, the bailiffs were already there in among the family retainers, dressed in family livery. Something of a revival followed in the 19th century under the third Duke, who managed to die solvent, but his daughter took on the estate, and then sadly her son, the heir, died in the First World War. He was killed in Ploegesteert, just on the Belgian border, having given up his Christmas leave so a married officer could go home. So sadly, his death spelt the end for the family dynasty. The house was sold in 1921 to somebody who wanted to give it to the public and make it a national, an open site for the public. But the National Trust Country House scheme hadn't come into effect. There was no endowment to keep it up. And so it was sold again in 1922 when Stowe School bought it, or the founders of Stowe School bought it. The school moved in 1923 in buildings adapted by Clough Williams Ellis, who many of you will know as the architect of Port Merion down in South Wales. So that's it in a nutshell. It's the classic rags to riches story. And if you like, the coup de grace really was the loss of the heir in the First World War, which happened to so many of the great houses in this country. But unlike a lot of others, it was saved by the founding of Stowe School. The key players we tend to talk about. So the first person to build a house on the site was Richard Temple, who bought his baronetcy, 4th Baronet. He became Baron Cobham and then Viscount Cobham in 1718, having fought alongside Marlborough and made a lot of money at the Siege of Vigo and the Siege of Venlo. He died childless and handed the house to his nephew, Richard Temple, or the whole estate to Richard Temple, who became the 2nd Earl Temple, who also died childless and again bequeathed it to his nephew, George Grenville, Marquis of Buckingham. Now, between these three, you really see the house developing, and we are in some ways fortunate in that it wasn't then subsequently developed into a Victorian country house. So what you see is a neoclassical 18th century house almost in its entirety. George Grenville was a reasonably successful politician. He was Viceroy of Ireland twice. He handed the house and estate to his son, Richard Grenville, who achieved what the family had always wanted. If you look across these players, we go from baronet to baron to viscount to earl to marquis, finally to the dukedom. But to get the dukedom, they had to cross the house and become Tories. But that's how ambitious they were to achieve that level of success in the aristocracy. So Richard Grenville, the first duke, is the one who really spent the money, and his son, the second duke, picked up the the damage, but actually was unable to arrest it. And so he had to hold that sale in 1848, having had the other thing that they really coveted, they really wanted royal approbation. And so they had their royal visit, but it in many ways cost them pretty dear. 1845, Queen Victoria visited, as I say. This is a picture of Queen Victoria in a room that we're just finishing restoring at the moment, more of which are non, but she commented, "I'm sure I have no such fine apartments in either of my palaces." I don't think she was terribly enamoured of the Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. She came for a day, ended up staying for 3 because the weather in that January was so bad. And there are 1 or 2 scathing comments in her diaries about there's a carpet she's in the room that she's in at the moment, where she says that they turned down the chance to buy it because they thought it too grand. So Queen Victoria's frugality contrasts quite markedly with the Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. I apologise for a long quote, but I'll let you just absorb this. This is the announcement in August 1848, following the sale in the Times, 14th of August 1848. And I think it shows 2 things. I think it probably indicates that the aristocracy were held in high regard, the most noble and puissant prince, His Grace the Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. But I detect in here a sense of slight irony, and that perhaps a lot of people felt the family had it coming to them. And I often say to visitors, when you look at their portraits in the house, they don't strike you as the sort of people you'd want to bump into in the pub on a Friday night. They were very hospitable, they were very sociable, but I think to their own means. Although, having said that, we know they looked after their estate workers very well. So we move on after the 1848 sale. The 3rd Duke took the house over, and he died solvent, managed to recover some of the benefits, but with the loss of the heir in the First World War. The sale came in 1922. This one was administered by Jackson Stopps, known as Jackson Stopps and Staff, now the estate agents. And one of the Jackson Stopps family is one of our trustees, who every now and then will hold a charity event at Stowe, as he puts it, in the hope he might one day atone for what his family did. What his family did, of course, was oversee the sale that led to the formation of Stowe School, that actually did lead to saving the estate. So Stowe School was formed in 1923, didn't exist anywhere else. They formed here as one of a group of schools taking over old buildings. And one of the many, many very appropriate things that J.F. Roxburgh, the founding headmaster, said was, "We shall not have failed in our purpose if every boy who goes out from Stowe will know beauty when he sees it all the rest of his life." And people often ask, does that hold good now? I think it does. I think Stowe pupils really appreciate their surroundings. I'm sure there are times when the best view of Stowe is out of the back of their parents' window when they're going home for a holiday or a half term. But by and large, what I've found through the restoration work is the more we restore, the more they respect it, the more they're interested in it. And subjects that flourish at Stowe, drama, the liberal arts, always have done. It's always had that reputation. But equally, what finer place to study classics or art history? Today, the mansion and the landscape gardens are largely intact. The wider estate has gone. It was a 10,000-acre estate right up past the Silverstone racecourse. And I'm sure if they could, the National Trust would restore it right the way up and remove the racecourse, but that's not to be. There is a wider deer park around it, but the principal interest, as Nikki said, is the landscape gardens and the mansion at the heart of it. It's home to Stowe School, a flourishing independent school. We now have 820 pupils, and they continue to develop the site. So what you see from the mansion heading down to the west is largely the school site, but they do use the mansion. They dine there. There are 5 boarding houses located in the house itself, and the library is there as well. The school governors had quite an innovative approach. They struggled manfully for many years to maintain the gardens and the estate. There are 30 listed buildings in the garden, temples of varying sizes and shapes, but that was always going to be way beyond the means of the school. And so in 1989, they came up with a plan. Well, the plan predated 1989, but it was formalised in 1989. They passed the gardens to the National Trust on a long lease. Not long after that, the Stowe House Preservation Trust was formed in 2000 or 1999. And we have a similar arrangement. We hold the house on a long lease from the school. We lease it back to them for their lease, and they underlease it back to us to allow visitors in. So we are a partnership, the Stowe School, the National Trust, and the Stowe House Preservation Trust. And I think that's quite unique. One of the reasons we formed the Stowe House Preservation Trust was so that we could fundraise and manage a restoration programme, which has been costed about £40 million. A large amount of that has come from one anonymous benefactor who had no connection to Stowe, but realised we really had to do something with this precious, unique site. But we're indebted to the Heritage Lottery Fund, English Heritage, the Country House Foundation, the World Monuments Fund, and many others. In 1999, the plan was a 6-phase restoration, and we're about halfway through that, but the latter phases will almost certainly be shared with the school because they involve the service courtyard at one side and the stable courtyard at the other, which serve respectively now as still a service courtyard with the kitchens and an area with 3 boarding houses. So the future is going to be very much more joint. Just so that you know, we are a relatively small team of permanent staff. I'm a part-time chief executive. I do 2 days a week, although it expands and contracts to meet the needs of various projects. 4.6 staff for full-time equivalent. The 0.1 is an archivist, and we have house opening staff, community and outreach, and a custodian. I report to a board of trustees who are largely art and architectural historians who give specialist advice and governance. I think any of you who are school governors or trustees of charities will know the governance side is the most important part, but in many ways, of course, lots of people do this because they love old buildings or museums or supporting children and education. So governance is the key thing, but their advice is always very welcome. We then have a partners policy forum, which makes sure that the 3 partners, the National Trust, Stowe School and Stowe House Preservation Trust, are working in unison. And then the general manager, the school's operations director and I meet to manage day-to-day coordination, while we have one last panel, the Stowe advisory panel, who are largely the great and the good of the garden history world, who advise on restoring and presenting the gardens. So this is what Stowe School looks like. This is children not quite at play. These are Stowe School pupils in a robotics challenge in our great marble saloon at the centre of the house. It serves as a function space as well. So we let the house out for weddings, and obviously the school have their own functions there. One of the best is the Mercedes Formula One team come most years, or they have done apart from last year, for an event. And this was one of their Formula One cars in the house about 5 years ago, but it led to the lovely caption from the lady who ran the events, whose partner worked for Mercedes: "Your car, my office." So a fairly unusual pairing. So back to the house and what we do with the restoration. This is the largest country house in the country. We're not really fussed about size, but every now and then Wentworth Wood House in Yorkshire pops up as being the largest house. I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, we are 6 metres longer than them. Not that it does matter, but it's 192 metres long. That's the principal wings of the house, and it occupies 7,740 square metres of space. And Professor Michael McCarthy, who was the Professor of Art History at Trinity College Dublin, referred to it as the largest and most completely realised privately owned neoclassical building in the world. So if I now move on to our restoration programme, this is what large parts of the house looked like before we started work. So top left, you have a massive scaffolding across the centre part of the house. On the far right, green plastic netting in the library to stop plaster falling on pupils studying below. And hopefully this is going to work as a build. What you now see is the central part of the house. Our blue room, the blue drawing room, has now been completely restored with blue damask on the walls. The North Hall, the ceiling by William Kent, has been restored. Lions restored to the south front. We'll talk more about them in a minute. A painting, Dance of the Hours, reinstated in the centre of the ceiling. the library ceiling re-gilded. Before we started, we didn't know it had gilding. The conservators found that as they went, and so that was an addition to our contracted plan. The roof has been completely revamped. We took 70 tons of cast iron water tank and water off the roof and replaced them with 60 tons of lead, and the building didn't move in the process. The music room itself has been restored to its former glory, and the green plastic netting has now gone from the library and the roof has been restored. So what I thought I would do was give you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour to give you a flavour for how we do this, what we do, what the challenges have been, and one or two little anecdotes along the way. So this is a bit of a cursory glance through, but obviously I'm happy, as Nikki said, to take questions at the end. So our principles were that we would restore the building to about 1800. Because it is an untouched neoclassical mansion, it made sense to capitalise on that identity. The only exception is where architectural changes have occurred. There are two of those. There's the blue drawing room you saw with the blue silk damask, which had the door cases enlarged, and the North Hall, which has a staircase inserted, both of which have been restored to a slightly later period. But by and large, we aim for 1800, and that's the way we present the house. All our restorations are supported by comprehensive research in archives, in our own documents, and physical research on the building. We have a panel of experts who advise us on decorative schemes, which can make for quite a long decision-making process. So we build that in prior to seeking listed building consent. We consult the experts on how the building should be presented. As the work proceeds, it's documented in archaeological recording. Building archaeology is a significant factor because you never know quite what you're going to find. Recently, we took wall coverings off a wall and found the original Hessian on which the wall coverings in the 18th century had been hung. I write a full written report on completion. I do tend to project manage the work myself because, to be honest, that saves us a lot of money. And it isn't particularly onerous because I'm supported by an incredible design team of structural engineer, quantity surveyor, architect, and consultants for mechanical electrical work. We document and manage all our risks throughout, which I will come on to in just a second. And the aim is to preserve the historic fabric and only replace where it's essential. So effectively what that means is, with one notable exception, that we are largely doing a conservation job rather than restoration. You'll have seen in that video, there's a lot of replacement stone on the outside. So that was more or less a restoration. And one of the rooms we're working on at the moment is effectively a restoration. Information sources are many and varied. The picture in the top right of the screen is the Huntington Library in San Marino in California, which is where our archive is. Now, that's a little bit of a pain because it means that we don't have ready access to the archive. On the other hand, it means the archive is in one place, it's available and can be consulted by anybody. We employ a retired architect out in California when we need specific information. Occasionally researchers will go. I've been, largely because my wife was doing some research, but the bottom right-hand picture gives you an idea of what the documents look like. They're in 364 boxes, and most are wrapped up in blue ribbons and tied. So the one you see happens to be an account entry. Takes a little bit of going through to find what you're looking for. Moving to the bottom center picture, we have some photographic evidence from the turn of the century and the 1920s. But we have an almost unprecedented collection of guidebooks. So the left-hand side gives you an example, and each of those guidebooks has a fold-out plan, and it has explanations of all the garden buildings, all the rooms in the house. Those are an invaluable source. And then finally, the four pictures top center are condition of the house. So the top right, the gold leaf and flower, shows you plaster cracking around a piece of moulding on a ceiling. That's the kind of thing that we document and have to include in our scope of works. Bottom left is the floorboards up in the dining room, where once the floorboards are up, we get a good chance to look at the structure of the building and check it out and check the way it's evolved and check for anything that we might need to do structurally. Top left is a photospectrometer analysis of a paint scheme, and that is a microscopic wafer thin image of a paint sample, a paint section with 6 or 7 layers of paint in there. And I'll come on to that in a second. And then finally, the red picture in the top center, bottom right, is a sample of fabric. Sometimes we get lucky and we find samples. No such luck with one of the rooms we're doing at the moment, but it is a possibility. Once we get started on a restoration project, planning and monitoring are crucial, because every house and every building that's restored has to open at some stage for the public or for users. In our case, it's critical because of the school terms, and so we're trying to fit work in between term times. The pandemic's actually been kind to us, and we've managed to do work with the school closed, but we're having to work around. And if I give them a date and they want to use a room for a function, or they want to bring pupils in for a particular reason, we need to stick to those dates. Purpose of this diagram, this is the stonework on the south front, and you can see every red outline block is a block of stone that's been replaced. And I show it simply because we racked our brains for a long time on how we could track progress on stonework replacement to be sure we'd meet the deadline. And the simplest way was the best. It was to have that diagram of the house and to mark the stones as they were replaced or as they needed attention if they weren't actually being replaced. So sometimes simplest is best. I mentioned risk. So throughout a restoration project, I am always very concerned with risk. Upmost in my mind is finance. Do we have enough money? Have we got the funding in place? And indeed, will our contractors see us through to the end? Sadly, we've had 2 contractors go into administration right at the end of projects. And so that's always in our mind. And I'm always rather embarrassed when we have a project meeting, say to the contractor, still got your resilience as a red risk on the register, but it's a fact of life, and they know that. Other key risks in a building like this are the structure. We might take a floor up or examine a ceiling and find there is a structural failure. That has been known. We've certainly encountered 2 or 3 in my time. Supply chain, we were really conscious with Brexit looming 2 years ago and with the Notre Dame restoration that buying oak in France for flooring was a risky undertaking. And so we had supply chain as a particularly close item, close to our attention. Even now with the customs delays and transshipment delays at borders, that can be a real issue. And simply supply. Sometimes things go out of supply, somebody else wants them. We're acutely aware of that. Archaeology, sometimes we can take a part of the building apart and we'll find something we weren't expecting and perhaps have to rethink our approach. Natural disaster, we tend to think of floods and fires, and all of those we look at the probability of it occurring and the impact, and we get a high, medium, low assessment. But I can tell you that 2 years ago, as we submitted the listed building consent for restoring the western suite of Stowe, none of us foresaw a pandemic. Never crossed our minds. It will do now, and I think that will make us think of other things that potentially could have an impact. We manage this day to day now because a lot of the contractors working for us today are freelancers. They cannot afford 2 weeks off to self-isolate. And so we're treating them as a bit of a bubble in their own right. We keep them well away from the school, but we manage it daily, and they're undergoing lateral flow tests. But it has given us a chance to reassess the project. And I think the outcome we've achieved is probably more coherent. So once we get onto a restoration, the key thing on the exterior of the building, or the first thing we did in setting up our restoration program was to safeguard the envelope of the building. And that's the walls, the roofs, all the joins, the windows, anything that could let the elements in. And by and large, the building's in pretty good condition. But you can see here with the scaffolding on the outside of the building, snow on the ground, that caused us a slight delay because we couldn't do lime mortaring for a period of time, and we had to reschedule our program. But the main priority initially was to get the building safe, stop it cracking, stop it falling apart. We've got other buildings on the estate where that is a real issue. So that was the priority with the outside. And this is effectively the point where I joined the program in 2009. looking at this, you can see the left-hand picture, or left and right hand, are one of the colonnades at the entrance to the house. And the left-hand picture is no exaggeration of the condition that colonnade was in, or its twin was in, before we started the restoration. No render on the walls, bare brick. The render on the pillars at the end, really badly corroded, very dirty and falling apart. The plaster work in the ceiling, lath and plaster exposed. And all of that has been restored to pristine, and it still looks pretty much as it does in that restored picture. But the scope and scale of work have to be agreed in advance, and then the logistics of simply setting up a work site with that amount of scaffolding, keeping pupils safe, keeping them away from it. While this piece was up on the right hand side, boys whose dormitory was just inside the scaffolding thought it a great joke to get out onto the scaffolding and see how far they could get. So you know, they will always find a way, and we are always having to try and be one step ahead. Moving to the interiors, this is the interior of the Marble Saloon dome, that great dome in the centre of the house during the restoration work. So the key thing with plasterwork has been cleaning and making good. Where you see the conservator on the right in the white overall, Fiona Kelsey from a company called Cliveden. Those coffers, the diagonals in the diamonds in squares, were absolutely blackened with nicotine, oil, grease, just the general 90 years of, or more than 190 years of stuff just floating up to the ceiling and settling on the plasterwork. So that has all had to be repaired, restored. Equally, the frieze, you see around the bottom of this picture, there's a Roman triumphal procession represented around the outside of that dome. And lots of the statues had lost arms. There'd been a time when pupils had had a bit of a game of running around the 2-foot ledge that runs around the inside of that dome. And a lot of limbs were broken. So all the statues been reconstituted, all the detailed work, the oak leaves, the egg and dart around the outside, all of that has been reinstated very, very carefully with plaster molds. And just in the center of this picture, top center, there is, you perhaps won't see it on this image, I'll show you one in a second, there is a tennis ball. We come to the next picture. You can see, hopefully the blue arrow shows you quite clearly, that is a tennis ball, which at some stage between 1923 and 2002 had found its way up onto the frieze. It was decided that having found it that high up, unlike all the bits and pieces that were lying around elsewhere, that was worth preserving. So we've preserved the tennis ball, and it's one of the most frequently asked questions by visitors. If we don't point it out, they say, haven't you got a tennis ball here somewhere? So a little quirk of the restoration. Moving to the interiors, this is the State Music Room, designed by Vincenzo Valdre in the late 18th century and decorated in the Pompeian style. One of the key things through the house is the different influences. And here, the Marquis of Buckingham is clearly saying, I understand the discoveries at Pompeii, and I'd like a Pompeian style room in my house. So he has a Pompeian style wall paintings in his music room. The work was interesting here because we cleaned and gilded around the top of the room. So all around the pelmet and the cornice had just blackened over time, re-gilded it where the gilding was missing. But interestingly, there had been an earlier restoration that in places had left it really bright and shiny. So one of our challenges was to tone down that earlier restoration. And as we reached the end of the work, during the work, we had asked Christie's, who sold this painting in the center of the ceiling, the Dance of the Hours, which is by Vincenzo Valdre, but after Guido Reni, that had been sold in the 1922 sale and found its way to a house in Kent. We knew that much because our sale catalogues told us. We didn't know where it had gone when that house, Wateringbury, was then subsequently restored and the painting moved. Christie's said they couldn't tell us where it was, but they would make some inquiries of whether the owner would be prepared to let us know. And we heard no more. We finished restoring the room in August 2012. And in October 2012, Christie's contacted us and said, that painting you're interested in might now be coming to the market. Are you still interested? So we went and had a look at it in Christie's workshop. This is the original return to position. We had a rather poor but adequate copy of it on the ceiling. As soon as we saw the original, you could just see the difference, the way the composition works, that the figures are foreshortened so that you're looking up into the center of it. Altogether a beautiful painting. But at some point in the 1960s or 70s, it had itself been restored, and they'd used acrylic paints, and almost all the female figures looked like Audrey Hepburn, I am told. The expert at Christie's said this is very clear. They've been given a 1960s film style sort of look, or 1930s film style sort of look from the 60s. So all of that had to be removed. Cut a long story short, we bought the painting and we sent it up to a workshop in Norfolk where it was restored, and they returned it to us 9 months later. So you can see in the left-hand picture here, the copy is reflected in the mirror. So that is the copy still on the ceiling, and the two conservators are holding the original in its restored form. It came in, it actually sits on it's on a wooden circular frame. To get it in, they had to roll it over a horse, which came through the door, then affix it to its cradle, its frame, and then winch it up into the ceiling. Now, one of the things that we've managed to do with this Culture Recovery Fund money to take the house to people is to improve our website, and very soon you'll be able to see a rather nerve-wracking time-lapse image or time-lapse sequence of that painting being hoisted back into position. And the picture at the bottom right just shows you the finesse with which this is painted. And bear in mind, this is 5 or 6 meters above the floor. The detail on that painting is stunning. And we now have the original back in situ. That's one of many artifacts we've brought back to the house. Every now and then we get lucky and people offer us things. We had to go looking for that painting. The Medici lions graced the south front, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, as they do now. But since 1922, they had been in a public park in Blackpool. So the picture top left is the Art Deco cafe in Stanley Park, which those lions graced for many years. You can also make out, I hope, on the top left-hand picture, that the lion's paw is resting on a concrete piece, and that his back paw is 4 or 5 inches off the ground, also on concrete. And this is because over years they deteriorated. There was a rite of passage. Everyone in Blackpool had their picture taken sitting on the back of the lion. But this poor fella, the westernmost lion, had actually got a broken back. So Blackpool Corporation contacted us and said they'd had some metal theft in the gardens. Would we be interested in safeguarding the lions? So we have the originals back here on a long loan, and Blackpool Stanley Park now has exact replicas in lead, because the logic is that the originals are much safer here. And if somebody took a fancy to the lead on a replica, it would not be a disaster. It will be annoying and sad, particularly given the scrap value that people get from metal theft is very small. But the lion, it was felt the originals are better safeguarded here. So they now are back on the south front. The lion in the cage on the left-hand side, the concrete lion, is a concrete lion by John Bickerdike, which had been on the school site since 1925, rather utilitarian, nonetheless part of the site. And Historic England would only let us remove those lions and put the lead ones back if we had the originals. They had refused an earlier application to put lead copies on the south portico. When the originals became available, they said, yes, you can definitely do that. And so the 2 concrete lions have found their way to the plinths at the base of the steps on the school chapel. And to be honest, they look as if they've been there forever. They just belong, they're of that age, the same age as the chapel. And it's a very, very happy outcome for everyone. The leader of Blackpool Council assures us he has a note in the diary for 50 years hence to progress the loan and get his lions back. I suspect the originals will stay with us because Blackpool are very happy with the copies. Statuary is quite an important part of the house. Those of you who come to visit, you will see there's no furniture in the house. And in many ways, that's a great thing because it means the spaces speak for themselves. but there's no sense of the collections that were built up in this house. But again, we were lucky. The Laocoon group was installed in the North Hall in 1835 after the sale of Fonthill Abbey in Wiltshire, William Beckford's house. And via another sale, it found its way into a house in Somerset. One of our experts was visiting the house. The owner said, "Oh, I've got something that's from Stowe. If you work there, you might be interested." And this statue, this fabulous bronze statue of Laocoon, the Trojan priest, and his two sons being attacked by sea serpents as the revenge from the gods for betraying them and telling the Trojans not to accept the Trojan horse. Laocoon was put to death by the sea serpents. This piece was sitting out in the garden of a house in Somerset. The owner agreed to lend it to us on condition that we would conserve his original. So we paid for the conservation of the original in order to have an exact replica made by the same person who made the replicas of the lead lions. So that's one where we've copied the original. We know it's the original because the sale deeds from our house to the Duke of Sutherland and on down to the house in Somerset all trace the same piece. It's got the manufacturer's name stamped on the left-hand side of the base. So there's no doubt that the original is the Stowe Laocoon, and therefore we have a very exact copy of it. Sometimes we're not so lucky. We knew that opposite the Laocoon there had been a Mercury. We knew that was sold to the Marquess of Londonderry, but the Londonderry estate were unable to tell us where it had gone, despite extensive requests of the archivists. And then it turned up for sale at Christie's in 2009, almost certainly as ours. That gave us a clue as to the base that ours had been on and its dimensions. There was no way we could have afforded it, even if it had been offered to us. So we looked for ways to have a copy made. And then quite by chance, our conservator who'd conserved the Laocoon and the lions found us one in America. It's a 19th century bronze, but in every respect, it is the same as the Stowe bronze appears to have been. It's after Giambologna, the Renaissance sculptor. These casts were made and purchased by grand tourists. It's the right height. It has the head of Zephyr blowing the wind underneath his feet. And we also know from our records, ours stood on a grey granite plinth, which we've had made. So very luckily, at relatively low cost, we managed to acquire a bronze copy. Had to be bronze because putting a lead copy or a stone copy opposite a statue as fine as the Laocoon simply would not have done it justice. So artifacts are important to the house, and some of the most important ones sit on our south portico. These are exact copies. Again, we know where the statues in those niches at the back and in between the columns at the side, we know where they'd gone to in the sales, and they were traced by an expert who also negotiated for us to have exact copies of those made. I'll show you this slide because once again, it's an example where we've had something copied, but it also shows how technology isn't always the answer. The crane in the larger picture cost £250,000. The conservators hired it for a day. You can see on the end there is a chain device that's then being attached to the statues to winch them up into the portico. They wouldn't fit. So the £250,000 crane didn't quite do the job until we nipped downtown to Leaders DIY and got ourselves a £6 block and tackle, which finished the job. These things sometimes happen, that you're faced with a dilemma and someone says, well, what we need to block and tackle. So there we go. Inside the house, there are also a number of paintings. Now, painting restoration and conservation presents very different challenges, but the left-hand picture here shows you a painting called Fame and Victory by Francesco Slita, which is over the eastern grand staircase. And you can see it's a trompe-l'oeil looking up through a coffered ceiling to the sky above with the allegorical figures of Fame and Victory. On the top of the picture, you can see it looks a bit pixelated. It's white and grey. That is flaking paint, all of which had to be reattached before the restoration could start. And then the cloud at the bottom of the picture, and indeed the surroundings in most places, The conservators, when they looked at it, they started cleaning it. As you can see, they clean it with a swab on the end of a large cocktail stick, and it's a painstaking process. But they said this painting looked as if someone had thrown black coffee over it. It was filthy, just from the wear and tear of years. You can also see a couple of structural marks across it, which have had to be rectified. But this is a fairly typical painting piece from these stairs, and that's what it now looks like. So much lighter, much clearer, much more obvious what the subject matter is. But this one led us to a really interesting discovery, because when they were doing the work, the conservators asked us what colour we should paint that cornice, the lighter colour border that you see on the left-hand picture. Because they detected on the walls and in that area 3 different colours. They could find pink, pale stone and grey. So we all agreed the obvious colour was the pale stone. But when they were looking, they also said, actually in raking light, we think you can see a painted design underneath the current paintwork on the stairway, the stair walls and the upper landing. So we asked them to have another look, and this is what they found. This is between the 2 cornices. You can see we've painted those in stone, as we said, but there is this grey, pinky, stony pattern, which they've uncovered in the grey part in the centre. And then to left and right, they've sketched where they think the pattern goes. So that was interesting. We asked them to come back and do a little bit more research, because we had some funding specifically for this area of the house. And this is what they found, or this is what we found so far. So the right-hand picture appears to be Minerva Athena in a niche. The trophies around the outside bear a strong resemblance to paintings elsewhere in the house. And the historical guidebooks refer to this part of the house as being adorned with warlike trophies. So it's clearly, or it appears to be, some sort of representation of military trophies. Now that's as far as we've been able to go, but we are hoping that we can fundraise for this. It actually costs about £3,000 to £5,000 per square metre to uncover this, because the work is done painstakingly by scalpel. Chemicals won't dissolve the paints. Luckily, there are only 5 layers of paint over that decorative scheme, but one of them may be significant, and so the conservators have to go back to the scheme immediately above it to make sure they're not going to destroy anything that is of historical significance as they go. So if I can move on now to something rather different. This is the room that Nikki saw in the summer when we were doing the ceiling tours. And I wanted to show you what it looked like before we got to grips with it. This is the work we're just finishing. Magnolia walls, bit of gold on the framework, largely silver in all the decoration in the centre. Effectively, this was a blank canvas, because this work, this room, has been a restoration and a transformation. So the first challenge we faced was what actually was its historical colour scheme, and we had 2 documents to go by. But there's this myth that for all time that ceiling had been painted in silver, and it didn't quite ring right. An old boy at the school told us that his house paid to have the ceiling restored because it was their house room, and when the boys left, 1 year group clubbed together. But the work was done in aluminium, and it was done in aluminium because aluminium won't tarnish, and at the time the analysis seemed to show that the ceiling was indeed all in silver. So we started with documented schemes, and there's that picture, bottom left, of Queen Victoria again, rather rich, rather lovely scheme. And the top picture is by a lady called Betsy Fremantle. Betsy was married to a naval officer, Thomas Fremantle, who fought alongside Nelson at Trafalgar. He was a protege of the Marquis of Buckingham. They lived down at Swanbourne nearby. It's a fabulous story. She was part of the kind of courtly circle moving around European courts. Her father seems to have worked in several European courts, and they found themselves in Italy as Napoleon advanced. They were evacuated out of Leghorn, and she happened to be with her family on Thomas Fremantle's ship. Several naval officers vied for her attentions. Fremantle won. She and he both kept diaries, and she has recorded large elements from his letters, including one charming piece where he says, "No milk today, the goat fell down the companion ladder." But that's all a digression, because Betsy was also a talented amateur artist, possibly tutored by Gainsborough and the Marchioness of Buckingham, who was also a talented artist. But she sketched this very room. This is the state drawing room. And you can see that she appears to have sketched silver in the ceiling, but a gold frame. But on those two end walls, either side of the window, she has used a yellowy orangey colour. So we looked at this. The guidebooks refer at that time to hung with orange damask. At other times they refer as with it to be hung with crimson or cherry damask. And to be hung we take to mean a plan that was never given fruition. We also looked at the 1845 scheme sketched by Nash. Now at this stage the room had 52 old masters in it, and there's no way that we could ever reinstate 52 old masters, but Nash has sketched it, or has drawn it, with a gold ceiling and this rather rich red damask. The general feeling was that is a rather over-the-top Victorian scheme, and again it departs with no good reason from our aim of restoring the house to around 1800. So we set about analysing more the 1800 scheme, and these are microscopic analyses carried out by Patrick Beattie, our paint analyst, and then showing where they are in relation to the panels in the ceiling. And what Patrick discovered was that ceiling, before it was cream, painted cream by the school, was actually painted in 3 shades of pink: a very dark pink, a mid-pink, and a pale pink for the bulk of the ceiling. But and so he focused on this 4th scheme, his dark pink, pale pink, mid-pink. But Patrick also discovered, and I apologise that the wording on this is rather blurred, but just where that yellow circle is, you can see there is a black mark, and that is believed to be tarnishing from silver leaf. That only occurs in the 4 corner pieces. So on his diagram here, these 4 corner pieces which have eagles on them. And we are fairly confident from that physical analysis that only those panels were silver. There's no tarnishing anywhere else over the leaf, and it appears it is gold. And you can then see it's been recovered in later on with gold leaf, but there is definitely evidence of silver, and he's dated that to around the 1800 point. So the physical analysis corroborates what we thought. He then comes up with a series of schemes, and we selected scheme 4. So that's just to show you the ways in which this is presented to the panels, and that's the scheme that was laid out for the conservators to decorate the room. Question of the wall covering. Orange damask was a little bit difficult to pin down. We didn't have a fabric sample. The nearest contemporary we could find was orange damask in the Peter the Great room at Blickling Hall. We took that as a pattern. Our textiles expert said she thought that was a very reasonable assumption. We had a panel of damask specially woven in that colour, and then copied it onto a non-fabric wallpaper, which is used to simulate the damask. And as at today, that is what the room looks like. So the damask has been put on the wall. The left-hand picture gives you an impression of the whole wall. It is stunning when you see it alongside the gold. The right-hand picture just shows that ceiling with its different shades of pink and the orange. And there's that little transition of the frieze and the cornice in a lighter colour. Otherwise, we weren't too sure what orange alongside pink would give us. We also had a chimney piece in that room. We had clear images of it, but it was sold in 1922, found its way to the Santander Bank in Spain. We managed to have it comprehensively scanned, and the copy you see on the right with the chap disappearing up the chimney piece is the copy in situ, today just being finished off with marbling around the edges, but we've included that bas relief of the Egyptian scene, all of which, this is all in wood, but you would be hard pressed to know that it isn't marble. This again was this morning, just finishing off the traditional skill of marbling. Marbling is carried out, I didn't know this, but it's carried out with quills and feathers. And that is a marbler in his 70s, he tells me, who's been doing this all his life. He was an apprenticed painter and finisher, and this is his specialization, is simulating marble, wood, all over the country. And I think that's really important that these traditional skills still exist. So the final phase, we're just moving on now. This is work underway on the dining room ceiling. Where you see large yellow post-its, those are areas of damaged plasterwork. So step one in analysing this ceiling was to mark out all the damaged plasterwork for consolidation. Quite a lot of salt efflorescence here, where salt has come through from the outside in extreme weather when the roof's not been in good condition. So that all has to be cleaned off, paint reattached, and then stabilised. This is consolidation. This is the some of the plaster work being put back in, literally screw fixed back up into solid woodwork. But the ceiling was in quite poor condition, but at least it was sound and there was no danger. The cracks are then filled with flexible filler, all approved by the conservation officer. All the materials we use have to be approved. And generally the cracks are then invisible and they're painted over and redecorated. And you can just see here the start of retouching. Again, as I said at the outset, we retouch, we don't redecorate. Painted panels that were in that ceiling have been taken down and they're conserved again, just like the painting you saw, the large one over the ceiling. Each of those conserved, cleaned, and they will be put back up in situ. And just to draw this to a conclusion and to come back to the idea of research, one of the things that has really struck me, and we will be able to show the public this ceiling right up close from the 18th of May when we reopen until around the 20th of June when the scaffolding has to come down. The centre part of the ceiling, the horizontal part if you like, is really very, very neoclassical. The framework around the paintings, the style of the paintings, and yet the coving, the curved part that leads up to that flat at the top of the ceiling, is a very, very free-flowing style. I just picked this particular piece out because we've done some conservation work already, and you can see how the gold leaf begins to shine better. This is a nest of swans and cygnets. Up above them, there is a squirrel on a branch. And every now and then I go up there, every time I go, there are dragonflies, there are real dragons, there are snakes, there are all sorts of animals in a relatively free-flowing composition, which contrasts with the formality of that centre part of the ceiling, but is much more like decoration we have elsewhere. So I don't have any answers. It strikes me they're contrasting styles. We've got a couple of postgraduate students working on this, but it is a fascinating insight, and being up that close to it really does bring it home to you. So my reflections then on this quite exceptional opportunity on an exceptional site. I think there are any number of observations that you could have. The beauty of the site goes without saying. Like some of the pupils, I feel that it looks best in the rear view mirror of the car when you're leaving after some days, but that's like any job. But it's an exceptional site. This is the primary landscape garden in the country, the first landscape garden, one of Capability Brown's masterpieces, and Brown served initially as clerk of works in the house before managing the garden. Today it's sustained by a unique partnership. I don't know anywhere else where an independent school, the National Trust, and a separate heritage charity work together. We all have different imperatives, but throughout the time I've been here, I've noticed that everyone makes it a priority to manage through solutions and not problems. And people are surprised to find a school that's open to the public. They're surprised to find a school in a National Trust garden. Sadly, sometimes they're surprised that we charge an extra small fee to come in the house, but that's how we have to operate. But overall, the site is managed through solutions and not problems. And I think that's quite surprising given the different aims of each of the charities. This was a house intended for seasonal use. The family probably spent 3 months of the year here, during which they wined and dined the country's finest. They tried to develop their influence. They tried to get people up here for whatever, hunting and fishing and strolling in the grounds so they could influence and get their political ideas across. It was a powerhouse of political thought. We haven't had time to go into some of the things that were discussed, but when I'm up looking at that ceiling, I always wonder, what things has this ceiling witnessed? What deeds has it heard? The loss of America probably originated in Stowe with the idea that the Whigs would impose the paper tax. Today, it's home to 820 young people, 100 staff, and 300 more using it daily. So it's taking a pounding that it wasn't intended to as a seasonal house, but it has been saved through that adaptive reuse by the house. Our restoration programme, in the greater scheme of things, given the school's business, given the way it works, our restoration is a relatively minor undertaking. But nationally, this is a significant restoration that we are very, very proud of. And we make sure that every job we do is underpinned by systematic and rigorous research. The house tells us things we weren't expecting. Every now and then, it will throw up a secret that we weren't expecting, like those wall paintings or the well under the south front wall. I think my abiding memory, and it's my abiding gratitude really, is to the craftsmen and people and women who've got those traditional skills, the stonemasons, the marblers, the conservators, those who do gold leafing, all of whom have precious skills. But it's not just them, it's also the labourers who come here, and they give heart and soul to everything they do, whatever their level in the organisation, whether they're a specialist or a general labourer. So that, to me, has been really heartwarming over the last 9-10 years. And that leads me to open the floor and ask for any questions you might have, Nikki.
Yes, indeed. I have several questions. So thank you so much for that, Nick. It's really wonderful. Really great to see the state drawing room in its finished state. Just wonderful. So
James, as you saw it.
Yeah, absolutely. The scaffolding tour, though, was absolutely amazing. So I should be heading up there sometime between the 18th of May and the 20th of June. Do you have to buy tickets in advance for that?
Yes, they'll be on sale on the website. We are able to sell a ticket at short notice if we haven't got a full number. I think we'll probably take about 8 people at a time, but given a relatively narrow window now, because we had hoped to do this all through the summer, we will capitalise and we'll do as many tours as we can. Sure,
that sounds great. So how many days a year is the house required to be open to the general public, and what times of year?
Okay, yeah, that's good. Very good question. In return for public sponsorship, principally the Heritage Lottery Fund, we were initially required to open 100 days a year, which wasn't very much. We then had a subsequent HLF grant to create our visitor centre in the cellar of the house, and we pushed it up to 180. But the school are really accommodating, and the headmaster has said, look, if you want to bring people in 363 days of the year, you're welcome to. So we open as often as we can. We open in term time with guided tours only because of safeguarding. So our volunteers, and they are far more entertaining than I, their voluntary tours are really good. And in out of term time, we operate a free flow system. So you can come in, wander around the house at your leisure. We have to have a one-way system at the moment, and those are any time when the school is not in session. This summer's a little bit unusual, and I would advise anyone please to check the website, because one of the ongoing problems I have is that a wedding in the house makes more money than opening it to the public. But of course, for the public, we want to have a predictable opening offer. So we tend to keep weddings to Friday, Saturday in the summers and in the holidays. This year's been exceptional. So many people have had their weddings postponed and cancelled that we've given free rein to have a wedding on virtually any day. There will be plenty of days when we're open to the public through the summer holiday. That period of the scaffolding tours, there are no weddings yet. So it's a bit of a, we're sort of coexisting a little more closely than we normally do with the wedding parties.
What an amazing place to have a wedding, though. It's absolutely fabulous.
It is, and what's interesting to me is I think that room we've just restored, the state drawing room, is going to be as popular as the music room. And of course, with the state dining room, with the ceiling restored, it's going to be amazing.
Fabulous. There are a couple of questions that are quite similar, so I'll consolidate. Susan would like to know, are there sufficient young people in the country training in the specialist skills required? And are there noted areas where there are difficulties in recruiting expertise?
Okay. I don't think there are any particular difficulties, and I'll give you an example. One of the conservators currently working on the dining room ceiling is an archaeology graduate from York, and he went to Chroma Conservation for work experience and was offered the chance to try his hand at conservation work. They're now training him as a conservator. But the conservators have such a wide range of skills. He's currently doing cleaning and gold leafing, but he'll move on to stonemasonry and painting conservation later. I think there are a lot of young people who are still interested in this sort of thing, and they do come from wide ranges of backgrounds, fine art, art history. We've even had a couple come to us with chemistry or biology degrees who've thought, actually, what I'm really interested in is heritage. The companies, one of the reasons that we wanted to press ahead with the restoration despite the pandemic was that across the sector, people were saying, well, if we withdraw contracts that we've drawn up now, a lot of these companies are going to go into administration. So many conservation companies have had a good year, and long may that continue, because they are dependent. But of course, they need to bring on the assistants and the apprentices. So one of the things that we try and build into our projects is that where possible, we like them to bring in students and apprentices, and they've done that a couple of times. I think, I'm not sure when you were there, but we did have 2 students working in the drawing room ceiling. The wall paintings, the uncovering is currently being led by Lincoln University, because they have somebody who went from a conservation company to become a lecturer, and she's bringing students up every time she comes, which is brilliant, because they have the opportunity to experience something new. And I'm afraid we get it at a slightly lower rate than a skilled conservator, but they do it under supervision. So yeah, there are young people out there, and I wish we could do more to say to them, this is a career, you can do this.
Yeah. So do the Stowe School students get a chance to become involved in any way in the conservation?
They do, yeah. Quite a lot will do, not so much physical conservation, but they'll write up projects. So we had a young lad a couple of years ago who wrote a secret Stowe project, which was fascinating, because he went into places that you wouldn't normally be able to get into. And the headmaster said, I'm not sure we should publish his work, because they'll all find out what there is. But some of you may have seen on a National Trust programme, under one of the temples, there's an underground canal and a water system. And Marcus went down there and he documented that. We've had a couple do work experience with us on visitor experience, and 1 or 2 expressed an interest in joining conservation companies. Had a student from Oxford Brookes who did her assignment on the North Hall, and she's come along to a few project meetings to get a bit of work experience. So Stowe School pupils generally, their curriculum is quite busy, but thanks to strong art history and classics departments, we do manage now to get more and more involved. History is one that their syllabus involves trade in the 18th century, so they occasionally come and talk about the house, but it's principally classics and art history who really do.
And the local community, you mentioned there's a community engagement programme. How does that work? Is that local schools?
Yes, yeah. So the Heritage Lottery Fund funded for us a community engagement and outreach officer for 2 years. And that we thought that was of such importance, we kept it going after the grant period. And Carmen Hooper, who's our community outreach officer at the moment, has been instrumental in doing a lot of the online stuff while she's been unable to have visits around the house. We try and bring in key stage visits for mythology, beasts and dragons. There are all sorts of trails you can run around the house. So a lot of it is geared to junior schools, and we run 2 big competitions each year, or we have done up to this year. Write on Stowe, which is a literary competition where the last one, they wrote a thank you letter having been invited to dinner with Queen Victoria, and an art programme as well. And the art is really good, because the way that some of these youngsters interpret the house, we had a girl who did a series of dresses with designs from ceilings around the house. You get all these quirky perspectives and then some straightforward here is a straight picture that I've painted of the south front of the house. So it's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So Susan would like to know the names of any famous old boys or indeed girls at Stowe School.
Okay, well, we start with Richard Branson, who started his first business actually just in what is now our Egyptian Hall. There was a phone box down there. Branson used to put a notice up saying, "These records are available in London. Anyone order them, let me know." And he'd phone up from the phone box and order them in. He's been president of the Old Stoic Society for a while. Henry Cavill, the current Superman, also in Mission Impossible. I wanted to get to do a fundraising video saying it ain't Mission Impossible. We haven't managed to do that yet. And then further back, David Niven, George Melly, the jazz musician, Lord Sainsbury of Preston Candover, who's a significant benefactor to us as well. And then there were 2 Victoria Crosses in the Second World War, Jack Anderson in the army, and Leonard Cheshire.
Okay.
So Leonard Cheshire, one of the 2 new day houses is named after Leonard Cheshire. And interestingly, the only 2 to win a VC shared a study in their first year at the school, which is, I don't know whether that tells you anything.
It's inspired each other.
And then Sir Nicholas Winton of the Kindertransport out of Austria in the Second World War. So that's a few of them. There's probably plenty more.
Fantastic, fantastic. So on another subject, how cooperative are property owners in allowing their treasures, such as the chimney piece that you mentioned in Santander, to be photographed and copied?
Generally, people have been really receptive. So obviously Blackpool allowed us to have the lions, that we've actually got the originals. The owner of the Laocoon is a slightly eccentric French count, but he's in his 80s and he rides 2 or 3 times a week. Lovely man. He was thrilled. He just felt that the ability to help us out was great. Chimney pieces, we tried to get Santander Bank to do us a deal where they would take the copy and we'd have the original, because actually the original is only in a 1960s office block with panelling in a boardroom made to look like an 18th century English house, because that's how they started their trade. They cooperated really well. And the chimney pieces for the dining room are full height, right up floor to ceiling. They're in a house in Berkshire, which is, they're quite secretive about what they're doing because they're doing a complete rebuild. And as soon as we asked the agent, she asked the owner, who said, yes, of course. We asked the site manager, who has been, I mean, this man is running a project that makes my eyes water to transform an 18th century house in Berkshire. And he could not have been more helpful. So we've been extremely fortunate, yeah.
That's lovely. That's lovely to hear. Gillian would like to know, did you learn anything from the restoration of Up in West Sussex and National Trust generally, which links to a question that I had about fire protection? How do you deal with that?
Well, that was the principal thing we learned from Up Ark, and I've got on my shelf here there's a little book written about the Up Ark fire, which is horrifying, because one of the first things they discovered was that first of all, it was caused by hot work. So they were doing work on lead, and a stray spark ignited the timbers in the ceiling, in the roof, and it looked quite innocuous at first. I don't know if anyone's seen video of it, but it was a little bit of smoke, then a little bit of flame, and then the next thing it's a conflagration. So hot works are really closely controlled. There has to be a permit and a cooling down period. What we also learned from Up Ark is that fire travels through the voids in walls. So you can put it out at one end of the building and it will pop out the far end of the building. So we had a comprehensive program to map all our voids and to fire stop them. And then to your question, Nikki, when we restored the state drawing room, we found under the floor the original what they call pugging, which is a layer of sort of lime material, but it's laid on a reed bed. The reed bed is tinder dry and therefore a massive fire risk, but we didn't want to take it out because it was original material. So we laid a fireproof carpet, very much like a fire blanket you'd have at home, slightly thicker. We laid that over the top of the original material, and then we tuck it up into the voids. So every floor is lined, if there isn't anything there already, is lined with rock wool, which is a fire preventative. But now we've got this, we've discovered this matting, so we'll be using that more and more. general lessons from restoration. I think a lot of those come through the conservators. So they've worked in different places and they'll come to us and say, oh, we found this there and we've done this. And so we tend to pick that up at the tender stage with their expertise. And they're very free at sharing where they've worked. And one of the guys working on the ceiling said, oh, he said, this ceiling is by Francesco Sleater, isn't it? He said, I restored his church at Merryworth in Kent. So there's quite a lot of interchange, which again is good.
Fantastic. So my penultimate question is, will all parts of the house be restored, or will there be little back areas which you haven't got time for, don't get, nor money for?
Well, our aim is to complete the restoration of the main state rooms by 2023. At each end of the extreme, the west front, the south front of the house, the rooms on the far east the two rooms are actually boys' boarding rooms, dormitories, which we probably won't do, but we will advise the school because they're historically very significant. But the cost of doing them, the school currently can't contemplate it, so they're just conserving as best they can. At the extreme west end is another room that isn't, so the lease is divided up and we have responsibility for a set number of state rooms, which go from the dining room through to the blue drawing room, the opposite side of the library, the dining room and library being a matched pair. The extreme western room is called the garter room because it has the insignia of the garter on the ceiling. And it's the one place you can go now and see Palmyran style decoration since ISIS blew up Palmyra. And that is a really significant room, which we would like to get our hands on and restore, but it's where the pupils pick up their lunches. So it is the servery at the moment. Little chance of doing that. However, with an expanding school, it's possible they're going to have to think again about their catering arrangements. So we would like to do that one, but we're talking to the school about what can be done to it. All of those rooms are open, so provided the pupils aren't picking up their meals. So there are some tours that don't quite get to see the garter room. But we do try and show visitors around the whole house, and we will finish with the dining room and possibly the small room next to it by 2023, and then we'll start it all over again.
So that was my final question. How many more years of work? So will you stay there until the end? You hope to? Yeah,
I hope my wife's not listening. I came into this job, this is the longest I've been in one job, if you count my time at the school as well. And in fact, I've been with SHPT almost as long as any other job I had in the past. And every now and then I think, there are two sides to this, aren't there? I should let someone else have a go because it's a great opportunity. And also I'd like to retire and properly and enjoy doing other things, but it does draw you in. And I think 2023 is a bit of a watershed. The school's centenary, Chairman of Trustees feels he should stand down for good governance. I feel I should probably stop at that point. The one thing I will miss is that east staircase painting. I would love to see that completely uncovered, but it probably calls for somebody with specialist skills to undertake that. So yeah, I've got at least 6 months and then we'll see.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Nick. That's absolutely wonderful. Brilliant talk. And I'll now hand over to Roy Henderson. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks. So I stop now, don't I? And
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much to everyone.
You can stay on and listen if you like.
Okay.
Anyway,
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nick. That was great. We've probably all visited and enjoyed places like Stowe sometime in our lives without giving much thought to how much expertise and hard work is involved in keeping these old buildings going for generations. Forth Bridge, I would say, comes to mind. But the details are incredible, and the skills and enthusiasm of your volunteers and professionals is really amazing. Personally, I'd never heard of a marbler, so it sounds like a good job. And anyway, you learn something new every day. So thanks very much, and I'm sure many of our members will be putting Stowe on their list of places to visit as we emerge from captivity. So thanks a lot. Maybe see you. Maybe not the scaffolding, a bit too high for me, but we walk around would be great.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks a lot. As usual, the talk will be available for some time on YouTube. So our members, please tell your friends so that they can enjoy it as well. It's a really interesting one, that. So on other business, what's been happening since last time we met? Well, the roadmap out of COVID seems to be holding up reasonably well, and we are gradually restarting our activities as various milestones are passed. So from this month, we've started our outdoor rambles in groups of 6, of course, and we will be in touch with our group leaders about the possibilities for resuming small open air meetings in gardens or elsewhere, so that we can at last meet some real people rather than the electronic versions we see on Zoom. There's still a long way to go though, and it's all subject to the virus remaining under control. But we'll keep you posted on the next stages, so watch out. One big thing we're looking at is how we can attract new members to rebuild our numbers after the COVID hiatus. And we're planning a major recruiting campaign for later in the year when we have more activities to offer and maybe people start looking for new things to do. We've set up a small team to look at the issues, including beefing up our website and looking for more modern methods of publicity with Facebook and other social media. There's a lot to do. And we'll also be reviewing our current activities to make sure we're giving our members what they want. So you'll be hearing more about this from the team quite soon now, I think. Also, a quick reminder about our online annual general meeting set for 2nd of June. The annual report and accounts for 2020 have been completed and will be posted on our website for members to read in a week or so, I think. Shortly after that, we'll be contacting every member by email or by post, inviting them to read the report, send us their views and vote on the various resolutions to be discussed at the meeting. So please look out for this and let us have your votes, comments and suggestions in good time for the meeting. It's also very important to have a good show of members present on the day. So please note the date in your diary, Wednesday, 2nd of June, 2021 at 2 p.m. It'll be followed by a very interesting talk, which has been scheduled for that day on the Foundling Museum. So that'll be something worth looking forward to as well. Now, finally, on to next month's talk. This will be at the usual time, 2 p.m. on Wednesday, 5th of May, when the subject will be Sacrifice and Remembrance on the work of the War Graves Commission, which has a massive task of preserving the hundreds of graveyards and monuments here and abroad, commemorating the fallen of both world wars and more recent conflicts indeed. It's not just about stones though. The talk will cover some of the human stories behind the inscriptions. Our speaker is Jeremy Prescott, who's seen active service as an army officer, and he's now heavily involved in charity work supporting military veterans and other community causes. So it should be a good talk, and I hope to see you there. In the meantime, enjoy your new freedoms, but remember, it ain't over yet. The virus is still out there, so be careful and see you next time.